talking about some characteristics of the disciple. Although I don't know why the Mary guy is talking about available, but it wasn't my choice. So we're talking about being faithful, which I know is a word that gets thrown around quite a bit in the church. But what does that really mean? What would be like some of your guys' definition of a faithful person? Committed, obedient,
Trusting.
Trusting,
Yeah.
trusted,
Intentional.
exceptional,
Intentional.
intentional. Okay, that makes more sense.
Superior.
Yeah, I think those are good definitions. I saw one that was like someone who follows through regardless of difficulty, or its love hanging on, or to someone who's loyal can be depended on. And from my experience, like the most effective disciples have been like not the wisest or the most gifted, but the ones who actually are faithful. And the same thing in my life, the people who really make a difference are the people who are there consistently. Would you guys turn in your Bibles, if you have them, to Acts chapter 14? Take a look at Paul as an example. Listen up, guys. Just kidding. Does somebody with a nice loud voice want to read chapter 14, 1 through 7?
Now, at Iconium.
If you mispronounce any names, we're going to throw you outside. So, be careful. It's pretty rainy.
Okay, now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. Just till 4 or?
Till 7.
Till 7, okay. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. And there they continued to preach the gospel.
I wanted somebody else to have to pronounce the cities before I did. So then Paul and Barnabas proceeded to heal a man in the city by the power of the Spirit, a man who couldn't walk before. But this prompted the crowd to start worshiping them, which they were not too happy about. But the tables turned pretty quickly. The pendulum swung to the other side, like as if Paul and Barnabas were like president of America or something. And picking back up in verse 19, then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. I did a double take when I read that part. It just like casually mentions he got stoned, which has nothing to do with drugs, by the way. Somebody made that joke in my small group. I'm like, thanks a lot. Stealing it. They took him outside the city and literally threw rocks at him until they thought he was dead. And just casually mentions it right at the end there. Picking back up. After the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day he and Barnabas left for Derbe. They preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. I find that part pretty amazing. I don't know about you guys, but if something like even close to that happened to me, I think I would take a little time off of work, sit on the couch, probably gain a couple pounds. Definitely post it on Instagram and Facebook and see how many sympathy comments I could get. But not Paul. Paul was so committed to what God had called him. He was up and at it the next day. He was adding disciples even after the persecution. And this wasn't even like out of the ordinary for Paul. According to 2 Corinthians 10:24 through 25, he was lashed to within an inch of his life 5 times and beaten with rods 3 times, shipwrecked 3 times, and he spent a whole day and night out on the open sea. He even spent at least 4 years in prison. But despite all this, he kept pressing on, planting churches and adding and strengthening disciples and writing a bunch of the New Testament. Given all that he accomplished, I would suspect that Paul would be a very charismatic leader and teacher. But if you read a little, he's actually probably a little closer to Anthony Brady than John Mark Comer. In Acts 20, he actually literally nearly bore someone to death with his teaching, and they had to call in a miraculous healing to save someone. It falls off the roof. He gets so bored. But God was able to use him despite his weaknesses and despite all that persecution, because he was so faithful. Fast forward a year 2000 to our culture, and I think faithfulness is still a key trait of a disciple. Fortunately, being stoned, the rock kind, is not a big obstacle in America. But our modern culture still struggles with faithfulness in a big way. We've grown accustomed to instant gratification, shying away from commitment, and lack of accountability when we don't keep the commitments we do make. I was reading some stats from the Census Bureau. More than 50% of marriages end in divorce. 43% of children are forced to grow up without a father, and that's not even counting those who grow up without a mother. I just couldn't believe those stats. And the church isn't even necessarily an exception. But I think we can be different. Follow Christ's example of faithfulness. Just had a couple ways of doing that. Number one, if you want to take notes, be faithful because God is faithful. God is faithful to us, and He's the Creator, and we're the creation. So shouldn't we be constantly faithful to Him? Unfortunately, I know I a lot of times put myself first instead of God. But luckily for people like me, there's grace. In 2 Timothy 8:13, it says, even if we are faithless, he remains faithful. And for me, that's even more motivation to stay faithful, knowing that He's going to be faithful no matter what. And it's demonstrated throughout the scriptures. If you know the story in Exodus, the Israelites turn away from God even after He rescues them out of slavery, and He still leads them to the promised land. Jesus' disciple Peter denies Him 3 times, even as Jesus was headed to the cross. But Jesus still forgives him and restores him. And months later, Peter is leading thousands of people to Jesus. And then Paul, from that story, he was then known as Saul, had persecuted and imprisoned thousands of Christians before repenting. God still used him powerfully, and He can do the same for us, despite what we do. And the second one is, be faithful where we are now. Most of us aren't called to travel and start churches like Paul did. We're called to places like PCC, Starbucks, Safeway, glamorous jobs like that. I think one of the things that holds us back is daydreaming about the future and what our purpose might be someday. But often we miss what we're called to now. If we are going into those jobs and giving 100%, working hard, showing up consistently and diligently, I think we can really be an example to the people around us, and also really learn and grow from that, and avoid becoming a burden to other people. Jesus Himself worked as a carpenter for years and years before the teachings and the miracles and the Gospels took place. And again, Paul worked as a tent maker to support himself and avoid becoming a burden, even as he was traveling all throughout Europe and Asia. Number 3, be faithful in the little things. Luke 16:10 says, he who is faithful in very little will also be faithful in much, but he who is dishonest in very little also be dishonest in much. If we can't be trusted in the little things, how do we expect to be entrusted with more? If we're not faithful with our minimum wage, maybe tips too if you're lucky, are we going to be faithful when we make 10 times that? And if we're not guarding our eyes and our minds right now, what's going to happen when we have a spouse and kids counting on us? And if we're not working hard at our lame job, what's going to happen when we have a more stressful, demanding job? We got to practice right now when we have maybe a little bit less responsibility, and that'll prepare us for when we got more. Number 4, be faithful when no one is watching. This one's a little tough for me. It's definitely easier to be faithful when people are watching. It's pretty easy for me to go to church consistently, say the right things, maybe work hard when the boss will be impressed or it'll get me a good grade. But what about when I'm alone? Am I seeking God in the scriptures and prayer, and doing good deeds that are sure to be unrewarded? Am I giving the same amount of work when somebody else is going to get the credit, or putting the same amount of work into an assignment when it's not going to reflect on my grade, or maybe I'm helping a classmate? And I don't think I'm alone in this struggle. It's difficult to be faithful, and there's no short-term reward involved. But guys, if we do, it'll be a big blessing to us and others. Take a look at John and Kathleen. Again, getting a lot of love this trip, but I think most of us eat the food that they prepare each week without even thanking them or even knowing who they are a lot of times. But for years and years, week after week, they come in and serve without seeking any attention or any glory. As we wrap up, it's pretty difficult to be faithful in this culture so bent on instant gratification, and there's so many options. But I think if we follow God's example and be faithful to Him as He is faithful, and remain faithful where we are called to be right now, faithful in the little things, and stay diligent when nobody is watching, I think we'll grow as disciples of Jesus. Proverbs 20 verse 6 says, "Many claim to have unfailing love, but a faithful person who can find?" Those statistics we talked about earlier definitely reflect that sentiment. It's difficult to find faithful people nowadays. But I think as we head out from this getaway, we can change the world by being different, be set apart, and imitate God's faithfulness in our day-to-day lives. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for this weekend, God, for each and every one of us, for providing